Thanks very much to you and to the Society for your interest, and I'm happy to answer the questions. I think I'll start with the three questions you asked me about personal life, and because they kind of connect with each other. So first, my family and childhood. Well, I was a child of empire. I was born in Calcutta, and my mother was born in Calcutta. My father worked as an engineer. He was a builder of bridges. He built bridges in Egypt and what is now Pakistan and India and Burma, all across the Eastern world. My grandfather, my mother's father, was the harbor master of Calcutta. Now, in those days, someone like my father would take a 3-year contract. And at the end of his 3-year contract in India, he got 6 months leave to return to England. And he needed 6 months because half of that 6 months was taken up in travel by sea. Ship to England, 6 weeks, ship back to India, 6 weeks. It was also the custom that children like me were sent back to Britain at the age of 7. And this was mainly, I think, to ensure that we learned to speak English, because I spoke Hindustani as a boy and I spoke Nepali as a boy, and my English was, well, my parents spoke Hindustani, I spoke Hindustani to them, so they wanted to make sure that I learned English. So the custom was to send us back at the age of 7 to boarding school. But notice, in those days there was no air travel, so we did not see our parents for 3 years. It was not a boarding school like Hogwarts in Harry Potter, where the children go home for holidays. We stayed in the school 365 days a year, and we saw our parents at the end of 3 years. So this was a rather strange beginning. The system was very familiar, but it broke up while I was a boy, first because of Indian independence and so on, and second because of commercial air travel, which cut down the travel time from 6 weeks to 24 hours. So I was at the boarding school only for about 3 years. And then my mother returned to Britain and my father returned to Britain. And after that, my childhood was more normal. But two things that the boarding school did. One was it created for all of us, all us boys from India, from Africa, wherever, a problem of identity. We were not sure who we were. I thought I was an Indian. Then I went to boarding school in Scotland and I thought I was Scottish. Then my father came home and he was quite clear that I was English. So, it was difficult for all of us. And the other thing was that I never had any objections to learning languages. This was normal to me. Many English people assume that they don't need to learn a foreign language because everyone like you will speak English. But I never thought that. So I learned languages quite readily and was always interested in it. And I think that led on to my interest in medievalism. I was always interested in history. When I was 11, I won a prize for ancient history. My favorite book at that time was the Book of Chronicles by the Greek historian Herodotus, which I read again and again. As I say, I was I was always interested in strange languages. When I was quite young at King Edward's, Birmingham, which was Tolkien's school, of course, I found a copy of Sweet's Anglo-Saxon Primer, and I taught myself Anglo-Saxon out of the primer. And then I continued this at Cambridge, where I studied Old English and Old Norse. So I think the identity issue made me interested in how we got to be where we were, and the language issue, because I was familiar with boys who didn't speak English, didn't speak Hindi, they spoke Punjabi or Swahili. That was all quite familiar to me. So I was always ready to experience another language. And I think those are probably that is probably the kind of these are the formative experiences of my early life. I think actually probably you might say that what I became interested in, apart from other languages, was other cultures, that people did not all live the same way. And I, of course, was very familiar with that from having been born in India, where, for instance, it is very common. It was a multi-faith society. We had Hindus, and we had Muslims, and we had Christians, and we had Buddhists. And so, this made me curious as to why there were these differences. And obviously, the answer to that was that it lay in the past. That was how these things arose. And so I became interested in history generally, and especially early history. Um, and I think the language interest, I was always interested in early forms of a language, like Old English, but also if I saw a book in Old French, I bought it. Uh, and the same for Old High German and so on. That was just a general curiosity, and the language and the history and the cultures and the beliefs were all part of the same thing. People often say, what is the connection between medievalism and science fiction? And I say it's quite easy. If you study medieval matters, study medieval literature, you learn that things were different. If you read science fiction, you learn that things will be different. So the connection is that they are always about difference. Now, I started reading science fiction when I was about 14 or 15. Um, and of course, I've read it ever since. So that's another sort of 60 years. And obviously, things have changed. I think the main change is this. When I was a teenager, after all, men landed on the moon in 1969 when I was 16. Is that right? And of course, it seemed that that was the science fiction of the time said that was just the start. And we were going to have a colony on the moon. We were going to go to Mars. We would have a colony on the Mars. We would investigate the asteroids, etc. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. It was a great disappointment. So the science fiction which I read in 1958, 1960, 1965 was all about space. And that has actually faded. It hasn't vanished, but it's been realized that this is all much more difficult than we thought. And it's not just difficult technically, it's also difficult politically and financially. So those problems have not been solved. And the turn away from space leads to, well, all kinds of different types of science fiction. Uh, Nobody writes utopias anymore about a perfect world. Instead, they write dystopias about a disastrous world. They write stories about the apocalypse, about what will happen after the apocalypse, and everybody has a different idea. But there are lots of stories like that. And another turn away, in a sense, is to write novels of alternate history. What things would be like if history had been different at this point or that point or the other point. And very often these are sort of what shall I say? They are wishes. We wish things had been different. We wish things. We want our vision back, but of course we haven't got it. And another turn away, of course, is that the great success of my lifetime has been computerization, which is not well predicted by science fiction. And so there is a tendency to turn away and to write novels about what I call game worlds, where you find yourself in one of the game worlds which you can see on your video games. And that, I think, is also, I can only say it, not very realistic. We know that isn't going to happen. But then people have become very uncertain about what is going to happen. The certainty of the 1950s has very much faded. And I think the other major change, of course, and I see it with all the books I am sent for the Wall Street Journal. Nowadays, I get 6 fantasies for every science fiction book. And the fantasies, everyone has to have a different idea, but they are quite similar to each other. They tend to be set in the past, or they tend to be set in a magical world like Game of Thrones, where we have basically a medieval world with a strong element of fantasy, the dragons, the White Walkers, that sort of thing. May you ask in your question about how often authors present a truly original piece of literature that pushes the envelope. And one that did so was in science fiction, was William Gibson, who back in, I forget the date, wrote a novel called Neuromancer. Not necromancer, which is someone who deals with the dead, neuromancer, someone who deals with computers. And after that, there was an avalanche of computer-oriented books. Another one, I think, who broke the mold was Neil Gaiman with his books of fantasy, because what he produced was fantasies which are set in the modern world, just like us, but there's something under the surface. There's actually American gods, there are Norse gods actually alive in America, or else he wrote his book Neverwhere, which is really about, you might say, the London system of underground railways with all its strange stations with strange names like Shepherd's Bush. Why is it called Shepherd's Bush? Because there are shepherds there, but you don't want to meet them. Or Knightsbridge, which is a bridge for knights. So the names of the stations are real and true, but we don't realize the truth because it's been hidden from us. So you have then the computer world, and you might call the underworld, which both these have become popular ways of writing. I haven't seen the whole of the later Star Wars films because they aren't very good. And I think the reason for the success of the first set was, I think, that the writers were very aware of early science fiction. For instance, as soon as I saw the first Star Wars, I thought I could recognize the illustrations. I could recognize the pictures because they reminded me of pictures which I had seen, on the cover of Astounding Science Fiction, or indeed in the magazines. They often had illustrations. So some of it was actually very familiar to me. And I think that worked very well with the original Star Wars sequence. But the later ones, I don't think they knew as much. They were actually building on the first trilogy, but they didn't realize what lay behind the first trilogy. I would say, for one thing, that a work which surely influenced the first Star Wars trilogy was the book Dune by Frank Herbert, a very big book with many sequels. But the illustrations on that were just like the early scenes in the first Star Wars movie. So I think they rather they were making it up out of their own heads, and that was not as good as the very great resources which had already been put into science fiction, 20 years earlier. So yes, they were a disappointment, I think.